Medicine evolves one story at a time. Here's one worth telling. This is History Taking. I was almost 8 years old when the September 11th, 2001 attacks happened. And I remember being in school and some kids would be taken home by their parents. And I was like, oh, everyone's getting days off. And then in the afternoon, my parents actually came to pick me up. And I went home and I saw the TV with the news going on. And I was just too young to really grasp the issue. I think for me, it was like, oh, this is the first time I'm seeing my parents watching the news. But obviously, at the time and long after, it created ripples in the way that the United States and the world functioned. And those attacks were orchestrated by one Osama bin Laden. And by the late 2000s, the hunt for this guy had become one of the longest and most politically charged manhunts in modern history, if not all of history. After the September 11th attacks, he kind of disappeared. He had the shadow network of safe houses and couriers and intermediaries, and it was really hard to track him. At the beginning, they started to focus on the obvious places. They looked at remote terrain in the area and mountain borders and areas where drones and satellites could be able to scan. But there wasn't a certainty of, oh, is bin Laden specifically here? And after a long time, the assumption was pretty simple. He must be hiding somewhere that's inaccessible. So that was the prevailing theory when they started this process, but eventually the United States intelligence community decided to shift their strategy and ask a different question. Instead of asking, where is Osama bin Laden? They started to ask, what made it possible for bin Laden to stay hidden? And that shift kind of led to the key breakthrough of the entire manhunt. They identified a courier that was trusted by Al-Qaeda. And that mattered because Osama bin Laden's network avoided electronic communication. So no phone, no internet, no radio. He was off the grid. But signal intelligence was able to grab onto couriers who leave patterns and have movement, and they could observe that. And they found a walled compound in Abbottabad, and they got interested. Because Abbottabad wasn't some lawless frontier town. It was a relatively developed city. It had a level of military infrastructure, and it had a specific compound that had high perimeter walls with barbed wire, few windows. The residents weren't really seen, and it had very controlled movements. Trash was burned on site instead of being collected. There was no visible phone or internet line. From an intelligence standpoint, it seemed so exposed for someone like Osama bin Laden, but the behavior was so controlled that it can't just be this ordinary location. And so there's suspicion. You might be wondering why I'm doing a podcast on medicine and I'm talking about Osama bin Laden, but that's because this suspicion led to this weird interaction between intelligence systems and medicine that I think is super important to talk about. So that's why we're here today. We couldn't launch a military operation inside Abbottabad in Pakistan because Pakistan is sovereignty. We could risk civilian casualties, and if we were wrong, the fallout would be catastrophic. So we needed confirmation. And so the intelligence community said, hey, eyewitness accounts, they could be wrong, behavior could be wrong, but if we get DNA, we can match that DNA and we can get as certain as we possibly can. So the idea became, if the relatives of bin Laden are living inside this compound and we get their DNA, we can compare that DNA to known genetic information from bin Laden and his family. We don't need to get the guy himself, but just his kin. And now the question becomes more scientific, right? How do you collect biological material from a compound that no intelligence officer has a chance of entering? And so the planners at the CIA thought about it and they said, let's think about it not as a spy, right? Not espionage, but more like a systems analyst. And so the question is, what is the vulnerability of the system that they've created? Who can go and get through the door without raising suspicion? And the answer that they came to was healthcare workers. In the area, public health campaigns had a lot of major advantages. They were familiar, they were local, and they had this moral authority, right? Like, no one's going to doubt your healthcare worker. And this justified them entering even private homes, and they also justified having repeat visits. It makes sense to follow up on care. And it also makes sense to get contact with children. In particular, in the area, vaccination campaigns were pretty popular, and they were low noise and high credibility. So the CIA approved this plan where they said, let's make a vaccination campaign that looked legitimate, but then had an intelligence goal underneath. And it would be run by this local physician named Shaquille Afridi, and it would target Hep B. Hep B is plausible, common enough that the campaign would look pretty routine. It wasn't designed to be a fake campaign. They were legitimately doing real procedures and really framed it and educated the populace on public health and the importance of vaccinations. But the objective wasn't to get everyone in the community immunized. The objective was merely to get access to that compound and get close and approach without triggering an alarm and get that biological material from children and create that familial relationship network based on DNA and reduce the uncertainty and find bin Laden. If we find him, then action can become justifiable. So why Hep B, right? Let's talk about it. Hep B is pretty common in most parts of the world, and it spreads through a couple different ways: blood exposure, sexual contact, and mother-to-child transmission at birth. We call that vertical transmission, right? The clinical stakes are pretty high too. If you have acute Hep B, that can lead to a resolution pretty easily. But if you have chronic Hep B, that can be kind of silent and insidious and eventually lead to a cirrhosis, liver failure, or liver cancer. And those issues can pop out when you've been asymptomatic for years. But if someone's vaccinated to Hep B, then vaccination can prevent those major outcomes from showing up, even if you could have had this insidious infection going on. So you don't wait for the viable illness to show up. You just intervene early and quietly, and you get the job done. The vaccine itself is pretty straightforward. It's a recombinant subunit vaccine. So basically, the immune system is getting a piece of Hep B, and your immune system has memory, and you're training your immune system to be like, hey, if you ever see this piece come into the body, you should attack it. It's a foreign substance, and it's not good for us. So if you train it on just a piece of Hep B, you're not actually getting the infection. But when Hep B does decide to enter the bloodstream, if that ever happens to you, your immune system is already well prepped to shut it down before it even gets a chance to fester. It's usually a multi-dose series. Multi-dose series is important for a scientific purpose because it allows you to build that immunity and that memory over time to have a strong, robust response if you were ever exposed to the virus. But for the purposes of the CIA, the multi-dose vaccination was also useful for them because they can build a repeat visit schedule. They can build trust with their patients, and it becomes this effective cover. So what happens then, right? So what happens is we kind of know the end of Osama bin Laden's story. In May 2011, there was a raid that killed Osama bin Laden. And the vaccination campaign seemed just like kind of a footnote of, oh yeah, we were successful and yeah, this is how we did it. And the government didn't really focus too much on it until journalists were able to find out about it a few years later. And then that vaccination campaign and the misinformation became public. It became public specifically that even though the healthcare information that was being spread was accurate, the whole thing was set up as a cover for espionage. And the consequences and backlash for that were pretty immediate because there was already a suspicion about Western medical programs. And now the question is, well, how much has the government been doing? How much have these Western influences have impacted our society? So the Taliban jumped up on this and they said, hey, this is proof that vaccination programs are intelligence programs. This is proof that our doctors are collaborators. This is proof that medicine is a Trojan horse. And it wasn't just propaganda anymore because they could document a specific example of what was really going on. And that's not great. Vaccination workers started to become targets. Specifically at the time, there was an effort for polio eradication, and there were threats, kidnappings, and assassinations for those who were just volunteering their time to try to get those vaccinations for polio out there. Communities began refusing vaccination teams outright, and polio began to spread. Clinics were shut down. The entire region became inaccessible. The damage went really far beyond Hep B to begin with. Pakistan, Afghanistan stalled, and in some areas, polio, you started to see the uptick, and results began to just completely reverse. And public health officials were pretty blunt. Missed vaccination cycles would cause those reservoirs of infection locally and also globally. But people didn't care. They just didn't have that trust anymore, and vaccination itself stopped being interpreted as a protection and started being interpreted as a surveillance option. And once you have a populace who starts to get that suspicious of vaccination, it doesn't matter what the data would show, that trust is broken. Public health depends on our voluntary cooperation, right? And that cooperation depends on trust. Eventually, they looked at this case and they said, hey, globally, let's agree that trust isn't optional when it comes to medicine and healthcare. It's an essential part of the infrastructure that helps healthcare work. So in 2014, the United States government announced officially that intelligence officials would no longer use vaccination programs as cover for espionage. Of course, the United States didn't frame this as an apology, but rather just as a recommendation, because undermining public health credibility weakens global security rather than just strengthening it, right? So when the policies change, the damage still lingers. The United States had done the damage, and even if we say that this is the new rule, the rule can be rewritten overnight, but the trust can't be rewritten overnight. So it's worth noting, yes, Osama bin Laden was the cause of so many deaths and so much destruction and so much suffering for people across the world. But in violating the trust that exists around healthcare, this campaign that the CIA created stole something that wasn't physical, that wasn't money related, but the credibility was what was really stolen, right? Clinicians that are allowed to cross and follow up with patients and be trusted with vulnerable populations like children are now not trusted as much. Parents don't want to hand over their child to someone that might be surveilling them. Parents don't want to entertain the idea of prevention if it could just be this plan by this Western intelligence agency. Medicine has this social contract that we don't really speak about. And that social contract, simply put, is that if a healthcare worker shows up, they are there to help. If that covenant doesn't exist anymore, if that covenant is not clear anymore, any future interaction carries a level of doubt. I'm not here to say, oh, this wasn't justified, we shouldn't have done anything to Osama. That's a political question. But the real question that I want to address here is the idea of, can healthcare exist with ambiguity? And I think that this clearly shows that that's not the case. We need to be unambiguous about our intention here and be clear that we build ourselves on a foundation of trust with interacting with patients. Without that trust, effective interventions will just fall by the wayside before they're even allowed to get going in the community. And for anyone listening that feels skeptical about vaccines and medical systems, that skepticism doesn't come from nowhere. Trust doesn't return on command. It's up to us as healthcare workers to earn that back. And that happens slowly through consistency, through transparency and time. And we can't simply say we are doctors, we are physicians, we are healthcare workers. This is medicine. We demand your trust. We have to earn it. We have to earn it by showing up again and again with nothing to hide. And we don't just act like this is some sort of biological certainty. It's about building this relationship and being clear with our intentions and being unwavering with our intentions. And I think it's important that if we want medicine to protect communities rather than just fracture them, we can't just talk about wars on terror. We have to talk about the war for trust. Want to talk about the latest episode or give us feedback on how to make the show better? Feel free to reach out on our Discord in the show notes below. Want to send support? Feel free to engage with our Patreon. This is just a passion project for us, but we're always looking for ways to make this better. Thanks for listening.